Hey there, my name's Marcus Vaughan. I'm the co-founder and chief growth officer at Illumina. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you here today to be going through BCI World's presentation for transforming resilience through engagement and influence. Great to be part of BCI World 2022, and I really hope you enjoy this session. As I mentioned, so Marcus Vaughan, I've been in the risk and resilience industry for over 15 years now, lots of experience previously more in a consulting environment. Now I've obviously moved over to co-found Illumina. We're a resilience technology organization really focused on engagement in resilience. And that is obviously to prepare organizations and teams to deal with very, very serious situations, but also give them really highly engaging tools to be able to respond really effectively with. So the question mark to probably start off this session is, why are we here today? Why are we talking about transforming resilience? And I think having witnessed and been through what we've been through over the last few years, there's been a few really interesting takeaways for me around resilience and what's worked and what's not. And probably one of the greatest epiphanies I've had, which comes to get me to talk about engagement and resilience a lot more than I used to, is the fact that resilience is clearly not a static thing. Resilience by nature is a journey of continuous learning. And I think with that, we need to start shifting our mindset from a resilience program being a program of activity that, is sequential in nature, and does start and continues through a life cycle until its very end. Now, I'm not here to take a jab at the business continuity life cycle at all. This is I guess a process and methodology that I've worked with for many years. But what I am asking is, how does that fit in today's landscape? I think one of the things became really apparent to us in the COVID times that we went through over the last few years, and all the compounding and complex situations that were thrown at us through that situation, was the fact that, well, organizations in reality don't really wait for a sequential environment to take place and for the resilience program to be perfect. And so there's a very big difference between how we've traditionally thought about a program of work to be undertaken through to what reality does and doesn't allow for. And really that means that having watched resilience programs be developed and developing programs over the years, and then watching them probably not fare as well as what we'd hoped to, and automatically as we'd hoped to, through things like COVID and the various different events that occurred during that time, is the fact that we do have to take into account that for resilience to really work, it needs to be very agile, it needs to be continuously moving, and it needs to contextualize around our ever-changing environment. And the environment is changing rapidly at the moment, like absolutely rapidly. The digital ecosystem that we're working in, the nature of the hybrid environment, the political circumstances that we're now currently in at the moment globally, everything is moving with absolute pace. So to create, true resilience in an organization, we're starting to focus a lot more on engagement, and really with the idea of actually building a culture around resilience and a culture in resilience. Peter Drucker, I'm a big fan of Peter Drucker. Absolute genius. I obviously put out a very famous quote many years ago that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I've got my own take on that. Having been through what we've been through over the last few years, I also think that culture does eat resilience programs for breakfast. And what I mean by saying that is, we can have all the board endorsement in the world, but as soon as we might apply what we think is going to work from a resilience program perspective to a major organization, the further down you go, that can get eaten up by an organization's culture. And so by thinking a little bit differently around applying a resilience program to a culture, we're starting to think a lot more about how do we actually shape the culture of resilience within an organization. Because if you try and apply a program or a resilience program to a culture that doesn't fit, what we're seeing and what we have seen over the years is that eventually it will get disposed of one way, shape or form. Of course, to create and shape a culture, there's a few things that come with that. Culture doesn't change overnight. This is a long-term vision that you really have to take. There's no big bang here that's just going to shake everything up and make it all work. Now, I think the other thing about culture, and obviously we're pointing at it in this particular slide, it does start from the top. Absolutely, I'm not saying that there's not a top-down approach that needs to be thrown away when we are trying to build resilience in an organization. Culture does start at the top. And you can use that to help drive it throughout the organization. But the other thing that goes along with that in shaping culture of an organization is that there's many layers of culture. Culture doesn't just live at the top. Culture lives at senior management, it lives at mid-management, and it also lives down on the shop floor. And so when we think about shaping a culture of resilience, we have to think a lot more around how do we engage and activate an organization, both top down, but also bottom up? Now, again, this is why I'm saying, culture can eat resilience programs for breakfast, because what we used to find when we'd focus all of our attention on very much just a top-down approach, that you may have the big stick to take with you to get certain jobs done from a resilience perspective. And that will certainly work at those top levels where they're reporting into the C-suite and into the board is prevalent. But as soon as you start dissipating throughout an organization, that weakens with its power and effectiveness. And so from shifting our thought process around how do we take just that top-down approach, how do we actually activate the whole organization using also a bottom-up movement or motion, we have to think more carefully around what are those activities and how does it apply to that organization? And how do we actually win the hearts and minds? How do we get people leaning into this opposed to purely just using the stick? How do we introduce the carrot to bring them along into this? In today's session, we're going to talk a lot more about that, moving purely just away from that top down and that very much the stick approach to also looking at the carrot and winning those hearts and minds organization wide. Where do I start is often a question that we see with a lot of organizations. And it's funny, as I mentioned before, we believe a little bit more in, it doesn't necessarily always have to start with, with one particular spot. But one thing I would say when you are starting your activities around trying to engage an organization and shape and shift the culture of resilience at that organization, it's really important to understand what's the benchmark. Where are you starting? What is there and how do people engage in resilience at this particular point? If we're going to shape a culture, it means we're going to have to engage an organization top to bottom, back and front. But what does that level of engagement look like right now? Now, I held a webinar only a few weeks ago on a really similar topic to this. And one of the questions, we had a couple of hundred people sign up to that webinar from all across the world. It's really good engagement in the webinar. We did poll the audience. We asked the question, right now, can you report on engagement in your organization? And what does that look like? Now, as you can see on the graph here, 7% of people put their hand up and said, absolutely, we're all over it, high degree of accuracy. 48% said yes, but with a low level of accuracy. And then 44% said not at all. So essentially, we're looking at 93% of organizations not having a really good fixture and measure in terms of what does the level of engagement look like in the resilience in that organization. And engagement can mean anything from how often are people going into their plans and updating them, could be what participation is there in resilience activities like training and micro simulations. It could be the touch points they're having with BIA data or critical data around critical applications. But if you're unable to measure what that level of engagement is in the program, it's very difficult to be able to articulate a story of where are we now versus where are we going to and what that progress looks like. And as we all know, people who do sign off on budgets for things like resilience would like to know exactly what value are we bringing to the organization. So it's really important to get a measure of success or measure of where you are at the moment, and then obviously report back on what that progress looks like. Being in Illumina, we're a technology organization, again, like I mentioned before, focus very much on engagement in resilience. So we have a luxury here of working with our clients and being able to provide that data on what that engagement looks like in their resilience program as we go through activities throughout the year. Thank you, metadata. I think one of the other key things, where do I start? That question we get all the time when we are starting to build engagement within an organization is really understanding the context of that organization. If you're fresh into an organization, there's a couple of really critical elements you're going to want to get your head around really quickly. And one is, what is that buy-in and that budget even in resilience? Is there a major budget for resilience, or is it absolutely a struggle to essentially get headcount, to get sign off on particular activities and investment into activities, whether that be internal, externally sourced by consultants, whether it be a technology stack, whatever it be. What is the propensity for the leadership team to invest into a budget for resilience? Is that shrinking? Is it growing? That'll give you a really good sign in terms of what that looks like and what's happened before as well. And it may also force you to get that business case together to articulate it. That's where that, again, understanding that level of engagement and resilience becomes really important, because they will have aspirations around exactly where they want to take the organization to meet the strategic objectives. One of the other key measures I always advocate people have a look at is getting an understanding of the amount of time that the organization is willing to dedicate to resilience. You can look at this at an organization-wide perspective, right down to a function or a person's perspective. Is the executive team or the crisis management or strategic response team willing to give up 2 to 3 hours for a tabletop or an operational exercise? What is that propensity for people to spend an hour versus 30 minutes in a BIA refresh? What does that look like, and what kind of pushback are you getting on that? We know over the years in working with organizations, we've seen a huge reduction in terms of what people are willing to invest into resilience, despite having some pretty lofty expectations of what's going to come back out. And that's obviously forced us to innovate and create things like micro simulations. Culture, as I mentioned before, what is the actual culture? How do things get done at the organization? And then how do you fit into that culture as well? And there's a whole host of different reads on this. That can be from, again, is the organization all back in the office versus are they working in a hybrid environment or a totally remote situation? Is it a heavily regulated organization, and do they really focus the resilience program around just meeting resilience objectives? Or is there very little regulation around that? And again, what's your experience and where are you coming from? And are you applying your expertise and engaging the organization to meet that of what they're used to? I've worked with a lot of resilience practitioners over the years, and it's always interesting to watch one in particular go from a heavily regulated organization like a bank or an insurance company into an environment where there is very little or no regulation. And the shift that you have to take, because you don't have that backbone of regulation to fall back on, this is why we're getting it done, is a real mind shift for those people. Very much similar to the type of organization you're working in, right? So working in a major government agency is quite often very different to working in a technology organization. Very different mindsets. A lot of the major technology organizations that have thrived over the last few years, their leaders are entrepreneurs at heart. Now, reporting in your activities that go around that is going to be very different for that organization than what it is for a government agency. So getting a good lay of the land in terms of, what is the culture of this organization? How do people get things done? How do they operate? How do they communicate? What are their expectations? What level of flair can be used in that organization is a really important point. So you hit the mark really carefully when you do get in there. Now, final emoji icon there. What are people's previous experience with the resilience program? I think if you're on the outset to start doing something new, or you're coming fresh into an organization, or if you have been there for a while as well, getting a really good read in terms of what those previous experiences have been like for the organization, and how they feel about resilience and resilience program activities is really important. If you're going in and you're getting a feeling like there's been a bad experience, you can quite often tell if people are sending proxies to meetings or they're just not showing up to meetings at all. And they keep pushing out things like tabletop exercises. You can start getting the feeling that, maybe the previous experience around resilience activities have not been what they were hoping for. And again, you can back that up using qualitative, questioning of, the exec team right down to operational and below. or surveys if you want to get a broader cross section in terms of how people have responded to the engagement that has been before you. And that should give you a really good read in terms of, how can you change what has been done to really up that level of engagement and give people a real fresh take on what resilience looks like. Do you have an elevator pitch? This is always a really interesting one. If you are dealing with someone who is sitting at the wrong end of that resilience spectrum and you need to re-engage them, how are you articulating why you need to get done what you need to get done? How are you articulating the value of resilience to them? And this can be a real challenge for a lot of people, especially as I mentioned before, if they've had a really negative experience, they are very much at that disengaged end. But also, even so, with those that are passively involved. Now, it'd be great if everyone's walking around enthused and engaged, but as we all know, that's not typically the case. But have a think about how you're engaging those stakeholders across the business to articulate the value of what we're about to do to get that done. And to dive into that just a little bit more, what's in it for me? This is a big question that a lot of people will miss when they're trying to engage stakeholders across the organization. Now, everyone within your organization is there for a reason. They're there to get a job done. And that job will support the organization meet its strategic objectives and below that, obviously, their functional objectives. Now, if you're not considering what's in it for the audience participant in terms of that engagement, you're totally missing the point. Each person has a long list of things they need to get done week in, week out. And if you're turning up and saying, I need to get this done, but it's not going to provide you any value to your function whatsoever, that's going to be a really challenging way to get that person engaged and involved in resilience. If, however, you're able to turn around really quickly and explain to them what the positive impact investing into resilience can mean for an organization or a function or a person, then you're going to be starting on a much better foot. Now, that can be a mix of things. That can be looking at, okay, what is this person's job charged with? Let's say they're head of customer service. Are they really concerned about NPS and churn? Then it might be a discussion around, okay, well, this is how resilience can, stem the flow of churn when a major critical event takes place, or when you have a brand and reputation situation, or when you lose a critical application that manages members or customers' details. Explaining how that impacts their job and their objectives that they need to get done year in, year out becomes really critical really quickly. If you're able to bring it back to the language in which they talk about, then you're able to essentially converse and articulate that value on the level of which they're going to understand much better. And this is where objectives becomes really important. Whenever we start a program of work or start resilience activities with an organization, quite often we'll start the conversation around, well, do we understand what the objectives are of the organization and of course of the resilience program and the resilience activities that we're looking to execute. Understanding the strategic objectives of that organization is absolutely critical. You should know them pretty much off by heart in terms of what your organization is looking to achieve on a 5, 10, or even down to a 12-month basis. And then breaking that down to a function and a team level as well. What does the balanced scorecard look like for the executive team and the various different functions across that organization? What do they need to get done? What are they being held accountable? And then how do those objectives align with your resilience program objectives? And then how do the activities that you're executing as part of your resilience change? How does that, again, support those functions, those team members, and ultimately those strategic objectives? How are we supporting them get done what they need to get done? And articulating that consistently and continuously throughout the activities that we use throughout the year to engage these stakeholders, because it is really through that ongoing development and that time with those people and that reiteration and that, I guess, reminder of, hey, this is, why are we doing this again? This is why we're doing this again. This is how it helps you. This is what's in it for you, your team, your function, our organization. Bringing it back to that level constantly and over again. That's how you're going to get that muscle memory built up around why we're doing what we're doing. I think one of the other key things to keep in mind, and this is one of the great challenges that as resilience practitioners we have is that there's a lot of research into this, and I'd advocate everyone go and do their reading on this. I love this stuff. Unfortunately, because there's two sides of the knife on this one, the two edges to the knife on this one. 80% of people are predisposition to optimism bias. Now, optimism bias is essentially thinking that the outcome is going to be better than what the actual outcome is. So the expected outcome you're expecting, you're thinking it's going to be better than what is actually going to happen. And a really easy way to sum that up is 10, I've been married for 10 years now. 10 years ago when I proposed to my wife, I never thought ever I would get divorced. And I'm not. It's fantastic. It's great. But I went into that knowing that the divorce rate is rather high. But I went into it thinking, sure, people get divorced, but it won't happen to me. And that is optimism bias. We appreciate bad things will happen. We just don't think they're going to happen to us. Now, this is prevalent across the organizations and society. Like I said before, 80% of people are predispositioned to optimism bias. Now, the good side of that is the fact that it actually generates a lot of hope. This is where hope is born, essentially. And without it, without optimism bias, people can be predispositioned to depression. So there is a good and bad to this. Now, on the bad side, again, on the negative side, from a resilience practitioner's perspective, we're obviously talking about typically trying to mitigate bad things happening. If those people don't think that bad things are going to happen to them, that creates obviously a pretty difficult situation where their level of care factor is going to drop. Now, one of the things that we know breaks optimism bias is very much a lived experience, and you'll see this every day of the week. You go and talk to an organization or a leadership team that's just gone through a ransomware attack over the last 3 months. Talk to them about cybersecurity. It'll be a very different conversation. You go and talk to a leadership team that's never experienced a ransomware attack before. That lived experience essentially breaks our optimism bias and helps us understand that, yes, bad things not only can happen, but they can and will happen to us on a long enough timeline. And that's where, thinking about how we can essentially bring and break down that optimism bias across an organization, top to bottom, becomes really important, because we're all living with it. Well, 80% of us are living with it. And it does, unfortunately, dampen the level of preparedness that an organization can have. Now, I'm not advocating that we have actual disruptions to break that optimism bias. And I'm very conscious of the fact that all activities in resilience do come with a resource impost. And obviously, we're big advocates of things like operational exercises and tabletops. They do create really strong experiential learning. They do get people to think outside the box, and they do get people to experience that lived experience around a particular event and situation. The only issue that we have with those types of activities is that they are resource intensive. And again, bringing this back to activating the whole organization and looking to get not just that top-down approach, that C-suite and that senior management level, but really trying to activate people and get that level of awareness down to shop floor. We need to think differently around how we engage them on these types of things. This is where microsimulations has proven to be extremely beneficial for organizations. It is obviously a low-impact way to engage stakeholders from the senior leadership team right down to the shop floor, and getting them to buy in, go through a lived experience in a 15-minute increment, and deploy these catalog of micro simulations to get that lived experience happening right across the organization. But it doesn't just finish there. One of the key things I wanted to talk to you about today is kind of hidden in this slide. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the dusty old exercise bike. That one in particular is obviously sitting outside of a lock-up garage. Probably be sitting away in storage for about 10 years by the look of it. Actually, probably about 20 years by the look of it. Now, I've owned an exercise bike like that before. It sat in the corner of a locked-up room and gathered a lot of dust. So what is the difference between that exercise bike not getting used at all and the exercise bike becoming essentially the mantelpiece of the modern living room? It's gamification. Now, Zwift is a great example of this. Zwift, which obviously does online cycling, as you can see here, has gamified the cycling experience and the exercise experience for millions of people worldwide. They now have over 4 or 5 million users worldwide, and they have anything up to 50,000 people at a time on Zwift cycling at one particular time around the world, which is pretty incredible. That essentially, through the use of gamification, they have gotten the exercise bike from being this dusty old thing that sits in the garage to a multi-billion-dollar tech organization that has cyclists on their bikes every single day. We've got team members at Illumina who are absolute diehards on Zwift, and they absolutely swear by it. The gamification, and this is why when we think about engaging people, again, across an organization, going beyond purely just the exec team and that C-suite through tabletops, how do we bring this to life for an organization, for even new generations of people coming through an organization? And there is a massive opportunity that does sit in gamification that we're obviously spending a lot of time on at Illumina with micro simulations. There's three key things that come out of gamification that essentially get people to come back and repeat that process again. Now, cycling on a stationary bike. I love cycling. Cycling on a stationary bike, I have to admit, without gamification, I still find extremely boring. With gamification, absolutely love it. It's fantastic. But the three critical ingredients to get this right, which really fuel our, as humans, tapping into the reward function of our brain. The three things that have been, I guess, measured and shown to work time and time again is, number one, instant recognition of the effort that's made. So completing something, essentially a reward recognition, is triggered to show, hey, you've done something, thumbs up, fantastic, that's great. The other two components of that are progress tracking, so showing where you have come from and where you're going to. And you might think about that and how I've spoken about how do we measure engagement at the beginning of this. Where are we now? Where have we come from? Where have we gone to? And where can we go? So progress tracking, really critical part of gamification. Also social inclusion. So humans are social creatures by nature, and showing where you might sit, whether that be on a leaderboard or whether that working with a team and working alongside a team or against a team in a particular way, that social inclusion is also one of those critical factors that essentially, again, triggers the reward function in the brain, helps release dopamine, and essentially gets people to not just undertake a process, but to come back and repeat that process over and over again. And we've seen a huge uplift of engagement and people coming back to undertake micro simulations in organizations where it has gone from a very static, very stagnant program to uplifts and engagement of over 300%. And again, we have the luxury of viewing all this data because they are doing it via Illumina, which is very exciting. So gamification is a really important piece. Now, I know I'm conscious of time, and we do have some time for Q&A coming up. But just to wrap up, how do we get that? How do we transform resilience through influence and engagement? So a couple of key takeaways here. Number one, as I said before, resilience programs are never perfect. They're never complete. It's a continuous journey. So if you think it's, you need to get that BCP finalized, or you need to get that crisis management plan finalized before you go through and do some training and testing, I just challenge you to think about, well, the fact that the real world's not going to wait for it to be complete. It will not wait for your BIA refresh to be complete. So just keep in mind, this is a continuous process of breaking and iterating and fixing and building in resilience. As I mentioned before, shaping culture does require that continuous engagement. There is no big bang silver bullet solution here. This is just having a vision and executing consistently against that vision to really start winning those hearts and minds and shaping that culture in an iterative fashion. Measure engagement. It's really important. Understand where are you right now, understand and know where you want to get to, and then show that progress tracking as well. Becomes really important when you go to ask for budget later on down the track, especially if people are worried about a particular threat type. So start measuring engagement right now if you haven't started that yet. I'm happy to talk to you if you need assistance with that. Consider your audience. What's in it for me? This is a big one, as I mentioned before. It gets missed a lot. I think as resilience practitioners, one of the biggest jobs that we have to get done is engaging our audience. And so speaking that common language in terms of what they care about becomes absolutely critical as part of that, and being able to continuously articulate and translate why we're doing what we're doing in the language that they're going to understand, that's going to help them get their job done. It's just such a critical factor. Optimism bias is everywhere. So when you try and start thinking about how do I not just go top down, but also bottom up in terms of engaging the whole organization around resilience to transform that culture, keep in mind, they will be dealing with, most of them are going to be dealing with optimism bias. But it can be broken through things like lived experiences and experiential learning through micro simulations and simulations. As we mentioned before, micro simulations and gamification together are just proving to get that engagement at a scalable level. So it does take a huge amount of that admin burden off a lot of practitioners to obviously drive top down, but also start winning those hearts and minds right across the organization, top down, bottom up. So that really is today's session. I really hope you've enjoyed this session. I thought I'd put up some contact details there. If you'd like to connect with me, it's my LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. Please connect with me. I really enjoy having conversations with people who are passionate about resilience. There's my email as well, so feel free to shoot me a note if you'd like more information. I know Illumina has a whole host of activities as part of BCI World. We have live demos. I know we've got roundtables coming up as well. If you miss all of that, we do have a gamifying resilience demonstration for micro simulations coming up. I think that's the 15th of November. If you scan that QR code, then certainly you'll be able to register for that and get an insight in terms of some of the cool stuff that we're doing around resilience. And as I mentioned before, activating an entire organization. Without further ado, I'll pause there, and I know we'll swing into questions. So I look forward to hearing from you there. Thanks very much.